It was February 10th, 1996. I was standing right about here, not in this building, in another one. And Marianne was standing right about here. And we were facing each other and holding hands. And we had said our vows and we had said our I do's, and now it was time for the rings. So I turned around to my best friend and my best man, Brian, and reached out my hand for him to give me the ring so I could slide it onto my new bride's finger. My friend Brian reached into his pocket and he pulled out the box that the ring had come in, which is a little unusual, not terribly unusual, but most of the time, the best man just keeps the ring in his pocket and pulls it out and hands it to him. But in this situation, he had the box, and I thought to myself, why does Brian have the box? And then I thought, probably because he doesn't want to lose the ring. Love my friend Brian. Great guy. Wonderful friend. A little scatterbrained. And so there was the possibility that he could lose the ring, especially because the ring was small. Marianne has small fingers. They're about the size of, one of those little sweetheart candies? Remember those? They're in the shape of the heart, and they have little messages on them. They say things like, be mine, or I love you. And now they say things like, they have hashtags, like hashtag text me, or I don't know. Which is, so then you go back to the classic, just be mine, I love you, let's be friends, you're great, whatever. So that's about, her finger's about that size, and so her ring's about the size of a sweetheart candy. So I thought maybe Brian was afraid he'd lose the ring, so he wanted it in something big. So he stands there, and he's got this big smile on his face. And I'm thinking, I'm glad he's happy for me. This is the best day of my life. Must be the best day of his life, too. So I'm so happy. He's got this big smile, and he just holds the box out, and he opens it up. And there in the box is the ring for Marianne. And right in the middle of the ring is wedged a sweetheart candy. And it is stuck in there good because it's the perfect size. And he's just smiling at me with this look of, what are you going to do now? Because somehow I've got to get that ring, and I've got to take it out of the box, and in the time it takes me to turn and get to Marianne and put it on her finger, I've got to get that candy out without shooting it across the room. And then I've got to figure out what to do with it, all without anybody knowing what's going on because I don't want the wedding to be ruined. I smiled back at Brian and I winked at him because I knew something that he hadn't thought of. He hadn't been married yet. And very soon, I would be standing where he was, and he would be standing where I was. Now, when somebody does that, we kind of laugh, right? It was a good joke. It was funny. If I thought that Brian was actually trying to ruin my wedding, I probably wouldn't have smiled. I probably wouldn't have laughed. It probably wouldn't have been a good joke. But I knew that he wasn't trying to do something mean. I knew that he was just having some fun, and I appreciated that because we were friends. We let our friends get away with a little bit, don't we? Because we know that they have our best in mind. I know that he wouldn't ever do something intentionally to hurt me. And so I'm willing to give him a little bit more grace than I might give someone else. We allow our friends to get away with a little bit more because we know that they care about us. And we know that when the chips are down, they'll have our back. And when we really need them, they'll come riding in. Friends are great. We're told that most people go through life, they have a lot of friendships, but probably only in your life do you have 2 or 3 really, really close, intimate friends. The kind of friend that you can trust at all times. And those kind of friends are a blessing from God, aren't they? They're an incredible gift that we can have those people in our lives. Probably the most, if not one of the most famous friendships in history is a friendship that we learn about in the Bible, in the book of 1 Samuel, between 2 men, Jonathan and David. Their friendship is legendary because they had that kind of amazing friendship where either of them would have given up anything for one another. We're going to look at their story today in the book of 1 Samuel and learn a little bit about God's design for friendship and what it looks like for us to be a good friend to others. But before we get there, I want to take a couple minutes and fast forward. we're going to go from where we left off last week to where we pick up this week, and in between a few things happen. We can't take the time to cover every event in David's life because there's a lot there. So let me quickly fast forward. Last week, we saw David get anointed to be the next king of Israel. But even though he had been chosen by God, Saul was still on the throne and still would be for many, many years. But right after David was anointed to be the next king, a war broke out on Israel, between Israel and the Philistines. And it was kind of a unique war in that the Philistines sent out their champion. His name was Goliath. We've heard this story. He's a giant of a man. Think Shaquille O'Neal, but bigger. And every day, Goliath would go out and he'd yell at the Israelite army, "Send out your champion, and I'll fight him one-on-one. Whoever wins, their army is victorious." And just as a side note here, remember Saul is the king. And Saul is the biggest man in Israel. He's a great warrior. He's everything you would want in a king. He's strong, he's tough, he's handsome. People respect him, people follow him. Why didn't Saul go out and fight Goliath? Just a question to think about, because he was a coward is the answer. David comes along, not as big as Saul, not as strong as Saul, much younger than Saul. Says, "You know what, I'll go fight the giant." Takes 5 stones and a slingshot, goes out, and using the skills he had learned as a shepherd, fighting against bears and lions, he's able to bring down the giant. And of course, he becomes a hero. He's a hero to all of Israel because of what he's done. And Saul sees this and says, "David, I want you to come back to the palace with me." And so now David is living in the palace with King Saul, serving in King Saul's court, learning what it means to be a king. Saul quickly promotes David to make him into a great military leader, and David goes out and wins more victories against the Philistines, so many that when he comes back to Israel and they have a victory parade through the streets, the people sing a song about David. It goes like this: "Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain his 10,000s. Now, how do you think that made Saul feel? Saul is the biggest man in Israel. He's the king. He's strong. He's a mighty warrior. And he's looking at his people and saying, "Wait a minute, you're supposed to be singing about me." And so jealousy begins to creep in, and covetousness begins to creep in, because Saul wants something that David has, the hearts of the people. And so Saul begins to develop this anger and this jealousy toward David. Meantime, David marries Michal. This is David's first wife, and it's also the daughter of Saul. Saul had promised that whoever defeated Goliath would get one of his daughters in marriage. And so even though he didn't want to, he knew he had to follow through with that promise. And so he allowed David to marry Michal. And so David is now married into the king's family. But Saul's jealousy continues to grow. His anger continues to grow. And he decides finally that he wants David dead. And so he begins to look for assassins who will kill David for him. And one of the people he asks is his son, Jonathan. That brings us to where we are today. Because Jonathan and David have begun to develop an amazing friendship. As David has been living in the court of King Saul, he's gotten to know Jonathan. Jonathan is Saul's oldest son, and they've developed this unique and close friendship. And now Jonathan's been asked to kill David. As we walk through this friendship today, one of the things we're going to see over and over again is what made Jonathan such a good friend. And so as we work our way through this story, I want you to be asking yourself this question: what made Jonathan a good friend? And then ask yourself, how do I apply this to myself? How do I implement this kind of friendship into my own relationships? We're going to pick up the story in 1 Samuel 19. David and Jonathan have come together to talk about the fact that Saul is not happy with David. And out of their conversation, Jonathan has agreed he's going to go and talk to his father. So we'll pick it up in 1 Samuel 19, verse 4. The next morning, Jonathan spoke with his father about David, saying many good things about him. "The king must not sin against his servant David," Jonathan said. "He's never done anything to harm you. He has always helped you in any way he could. Have you forgotten about the time he risked his life to kill the Philistine giant, and how the Lord brought a great victory to all Israel as a result? You were certainly happy about it then. Why should you murder an innocent man like David? There is no reason for it at all." So Saul listened to Jonathan and vowed, "As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be killed." So Jonathan goes to Saul, and Samuel says he said many good things about him. Here's the foundation of a great friendship. Jonathan was an advocate for David at every opportunity. And what that means is that Jonathan looked for opportunities to speak well of David to anyone he could, particularly in this instance to his father, the king. Jonathan wants to heal this relationship between Saul and David. He wants to bring them back together. And he knows that the best way to do that is to remind Saul of all of David's good qualities. Here's some great relationship advice for all of us. If you want to build a good relationship, if you want to develop it, build it up, create it, even if you need to heal a relationship, one of the best things that you can do is speak well of someone else. You know, we love it when our spouses speak well of us. We love it when our children speak well of us, or our parents, or our coworkers. So you see, in any relationship you have, if you want to develop a better relationship, you can do that by looking for the good points in someone else and then telling other people about that. You know, sometimes it's hard to do that, isn't it? Sometimes we look at someone and say, this person's not treating me well, they're not saying good things about me, and yet I know that God has called me to have a healthy relationship with them. How can I do that? Speak well of them. I feel like in our culture today, in our world, it's become very difficult to say good things about people we disagree with. And I see this played out so much in politics, right? I disagree with this person politically, so they must be a completely bad person and have nothing good about them. And I wish that we could come back to a point where I could say, you know, I disagree with you about this, but man, I really appreciate this about you. Where I could go to other people and say, you know, I don't agree with this person's position on issue X, but let me tell you about their good points. Let me tell you about the good things about them. And if we could do that, I wonder if we could restore some of the civility in our culture. Even more so, how about in our marriages? If I go out and I look for opportunities to speak well of my wife or to speak well of my husband, or in our families, if I speak well of my children or speak well of my parents, or with our neighbors or with our friends, or wherever it may be, if you want to develop and build up and heal a relationship, you can begin by speaking well of other people. That's what Jonathan did for David. He went out and he spoke well of David to try to bring Saul and David together. And it worked for a while. Saul agreed, you know, I shouldn't kill him. But it didn't last, did it? Saul continued to see David's popularity rise. He continued to be jealous. He continued to want what God had given David. And so one day, as David was sitting in Paul's palace, playing the harp for him, this is kind of really soothing. I imagine if this had happened today, it would have been a guitar. But just imagine Saul's kind of sitting on his throne, kind of hanging back, and David's over in the corner just playing the harp, nice soothing song. And all of a sudden, Saul decides, you know what, I hate this guy. Grabs his spear and throws it at David. David's quick. He jumps out of the way, and the spear sticks in the wall. David looks at the spear and says, I think that's my cue to leave. So David escapes. He goes home. Michal says, David, my father wants to kill you. You need to leave. She helps him escape, and he gets out of town. A short time later, he comes back and tells Jonathan, I don't know what to do, Jonathan. Your dad wants me dead. What can we do? And so again, Jonathan and David have this conversation to say, what can we do? And in this conversation, we see another reason why Jonathan is such a great friend to David. It's because Jonathan is more concerned about David than he is about himself. So we're going to read this conversation in 1 Samuel 20. And as we read through it, I want you to listen to what Jonathan says to David and see how concerned he is for David's well-being and that good things happen for David, even if it means his own loss. Let's read 1 Samuel 20. I'm going to start in verse 5. David replied, tomorrow we celebrate the new moon festival. I've always eaten with the king on this occasion, but tomorrow I'll hide in the field and stay there until evening of the third day. Big feast. It's a feast where the king invites all of the important people to come and eat with them. It lasts several days. David says, normally I'm there. Jonathan, I'm not going to be there this time. If your father asks where I am, tell him I asked permission to go home to Bethlehem for an annual family sacrifice. If he says, fine, you will know all is well. But if he is angry and loses his temper, you will know he is determined to kill me. Show me this loyalty as my sworn friend, for we made a solemn pact before the Lord." Remember that phrase. We made a solemn pact before the Lord. "Or kill me yourself if I have sinned against your father, but please don't betray me to him." You hear in David's voice almost this pleading, because he recognizes what's at stake here. Jonathan is the firstborn of the king. He's next on. He is Saul's son. And David realizes, I'm asking Jonathan to make a choice between me and his father. And it's a choice that could cost Jonathan everything. So David says, remember, we've sworn our loyalty to each other. Is that pact going to hold? And Jonathan says, never. You know that if I had the slightest notion my father was planning to kill you, I would tell you at once. Then David said, how will I know whether or not your father is angry? Come out to the field with me, Jonathan replied, and they went out there together. Then Jonathan told David, I promise by the Lord, the God of Israel, that by this time tomorrow, or the next day at the latest, I will talk to my father and let you know at once how he feels about you. If he speaks favorably about you, I will let you know. But if he is angry and wants you killed, may the Lord strike me and even kill me if I don't warn you, so that you can escape and live. May the Lord be with you as he used to be with my father. And may you treat me with the faithful love of the Lord as long as I live. But if I die, treat my family with this faithful love, even when the Lord destroys all of your enemies from the face of the earth. So Jonathan made a solemn pact with David, saying, may the Lord destroy all your enemies. And Jonathan made David reaffirm his vow of friendship again, for Jonathan loved David as he loved himself. Jonathan was more concerned about David than he was himself. He says to David, David, I know you're asking me to choose between you and my father, and I choose my friendship with you. I'm willing to give up everything. I'm willing to give up the kingdom. I'm willing to give up my life for your good. And then Jonathan refers to this pact that David has already referred to. I want us to look at that just for a quick second. There's this covenant between David and Jonathan. We don't use that word a lot anymore, but that's a great word for what's going on. They've made this solemn vow to one another that they will be loyal to each other and that they will be at peace with one another. Even though their families are at war, they will be at peace and they will be loyal to one another. That really forms the foundation of a great friendship, doesn't it? Loyalty and peace. And that's what forms the foundation of David and Jonathan's friendship. But you have to see that at the corner of this friendship, their cornerstone is not their feelings for each other, it's not their commitment to each other, but it's their commitment to God. Over and over through this conversation, they refer back to this covenant we made before the Lord. Because both Jonathan and David understand that at the center of every great friendship is a commitment to God. At the center of every great relationship is a commitment to God. If you want your marriage to be everything God created it to be, then you have to put Him at the center. If you want your work relationships to be everything God created them to be, then He has to be at the center. If you want your family relationships, your friendships, your neighbors, any relationship you have, then put God at the center. Look how Jonathan did this. This is another reason why Jonathan was a great friend, is that Jonathan was fully submitted to the will of God. Jonathan was fully submitted to God's will. In other words, Jonathan was willing to do whatever God called him to do, and that made him a great friend to David. Jump ahead to 1 Samuel 23. Right, in 1 Samuel 23, David's out in the wilderness. He's hiding from Saul. He's gathered together a bunch of men who are kind of his band of brothers, his merry men. And together they're hiding from Saul and riding around doing good things for people. But Saul is looking for David. He's hunting for him. And so Jonathan sneaks out to see David, and this is really their last time to see each other. And Jonathan says some powerful words to David that I want you to hear. So this is 1 Samuel 23, starting in verse 15. One day near Horesh, David received the news that Saul was on his way to Ziph. I love these names. Why don't we have cities like this, right? I'm headed to Horesh today. Do you need me to pick up anything on my way to Ziph? Saul's on his way to find him and kill him. Jonathan went to find David and encouraged him to stay strong in his faith in God. Don't be afraid, Jonathan reassured him. My father will never find you. Listen closely to this next phrase. You are going to be the king of Israel, and I will be next to you, as my father Saul is well aware. Now we read that and kind of say, yeah, duh. Samuel anointed David. We all know he's going to be the next king. What's the big deal? Put yourself in Jonathan's sandals for a minute. Think about how he's thinking as he says this. David, you are going to be the king. Because who is Jonathan? He was the firstborn of the king. He was the high prince of Israel. He was next in line for the throne. He deserved to be the king. That was his right as the heir of Saul. And the truth is, Jonathan probably would have been a really good king. You know, if we look at what he's done up to this point, we know that he's a great warrior. He's a great leader. The men of Israel follow him. He's a great negotiator. We know that he's full of wisdom. He's a good guy. He has a good heart. He has great character. So why not let him be the next king? Don't you imagine that as the prince growing up in the palace, Jonathan often would have dreamed about what it was like to be the king? He would have known for his whole life, I'm the next king. What's that going to look like for me? And now here, he realizes that's not going to happen. God has closed that door. Jonathan's dream will never come true. And not only that, but God has opened that door for his friend. That's kind of a tough pill to swallow. Have you ever been there? Where there's something that you've desperately wanted, that you've desperately hoped for, and God closes that door, and then he opens that very same door for someone else? How does that feel? That person who worked right next to you gets the promotion that you hoped you would get. Your neighbor across the street is always going on these vacations that you wish you could go on. Your friend that you've known forever has the perfect marriage that you wish you could have. And you say, God, why do you give all of these things to everyone else? Why do you keep closing these doors to me and opening them to someone else? This leads us into a dark place. It leads us into a place where jealousy begins to creep into our hearts. Covetousness, the desire to have something that God has given to someone else. This was one of Saul's big problems, wasn't it? That Saul was covetous towards David. He wanted what God had given David, the hearts of the people. He was jealous of David because God had opened for David the door that Saul wanted open for himself. And it led Saul into a deep, dark place of depression and anger, and eventually cost him the kingdom. You know, in our world, it's really easy for us to get caught up in this idea that I want what that person has. Because we have this thing called social media, where we can go on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or Snapchat or wherever else you may go, and you scroll through your feed, and you see picture after picture of everybody else's life. And they always post their best stuff, right? Look how awesome my life is. Look at this great meal I had. Look at this great vacation I'm having. Look how great my house is. Look how great this new outfit is. Look how great my family is. Everything is great. Everything is awesome. Right? And you look at it and say, boy, I wish I had that life. You know, science has begun to look at this. And actually, the American Journal of Preventive Medicine did a whole study on what social media does to us. And listen to what they found. Too much time on sites like Twitter, Snapchat, Reddit, and Tumblr may elicit feelings of envy and the distorted belief that others lead happier and more successful lives. We scroll through and we have this idea, they've got everything good and I've got everything bad. And it leads us down this road to covetousness. You know, there's a reason God said, thou shalt not covet. It's because it's not good for you. It leads you into depression. It leads to disappointment. It leads to anxiety. And worse than that, it destroys your relationships. Because sometimes we look at our friends and say, you know what, I can't be friend with that person because God's giving them everything that I want. And it destroys the relationship. Jonathan had every reason to feel that way. Jonathan spent his entire life believing that he would be the next king, that that was God's role for him. And now he's discovered that that's not going to happen, and that it's going to be his best friend David that gets what he wanted. But Jonathan doesn't dive into the dark hole of jealousy. And Jonathan doesn't dive into the dark hole of covetousness. Why? Because Jonathan is fully submitted to the will of God. He realizes that whatever he may have thought he wanted, wherever he may have thought he was going, God has something different and something better. You see, when we really believe that God knows what is best and does what is best, then we can rely on Him to lead us where we need to go. Even if it's not where we think we want to be, and if it's not in the time we would like it to happen. Because God's timing is not always ours, and He doesn't always lead us where we think we should go. But if we are fully submitted to His will, He takes us exactly where we want to go. What an amazing friend Jonathan is. To go to David and say, David, I don't get to be king, but you do. And then he says, and I am right there with you. I support you. I've got your back. What an amazing friend. Now, I imagine as you think about Jonathan, you're thinking to yourself, boy, I want to have friends like that. I know I do. I want to have friends like Jonathan. I want to have people who are always looking out for my good. I want to have people who are always saying nice things about me. I want to have people who are happy for me when good things happen, and they weep with me when bad things happen. I want that kind of a friend. But please don't leave this morning thinking that's the application of this sermon. All right? Because listen, if you want to have friends like Jonathan, you need to be a friend like Jonathan. Before you have those friends, you need to be that friend. So the application here is not, I'm going to wait until I have a good friend. It's, I'm going to go out and I'm going to be a good friend. I'm going to be the kind of friend who says good things about other people. I'm going to be the kind of friend who is more concerned about others than I am about myself. I'm going to be the kind of friend that rejoices when good things happen to others and weeps when bad things happen to them. I'm not going to covet what they have. I'm not going to be jealous of what they have. I'm going to be fully submitted to God and recognize that He gives them what they need and He gives me what I need. And while you wait for those relationships to develop, in those moments when maybe you feel a little bit alone and wonder if you'll ever have those relationships, I want you to remember this. Jesus is the best friend you could ever have. Jesus said something about friendship in the book of John. In John 15:13, He said, the best friend, the greatest friend that anyone could have is one who gives his life for his friends. That's the best friend. And that's what Jesus did for us. He gave His life for us. Does that sound like Jonathan? It should, because Jonathan is a representation of Jesus. Think about what Jonathan did for David. He warned him when trouble was on the way. He spoke well of him. He rejoiced with him. He was there to meet his needs, even at his own expense. And he had this covenant of faithfulness with him. And that's who Jesus is for us. Jesus warns us. He came to earth and said, repent and believe, for the kingdom is at hand. Leave your old life. It doesn't work. Accept the new life that I have to offer you. Jesus speaks well of us. Did you know that right now, Jesus is sitting beside God the Father, speaking well of you? He's interceding on your behalf. He's saying all of the good things He can to God. Saying, look at this guy. Look at this girl. Look what they're doing for you. God, look on them with favor. That's what Jesus is doing for us right now. He's that kind of friend. Jesus is willing to give up anything and everything for us. In fact, He went to the cross to do for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. Jesus is a friend who rejoices with us. He feels joy when we feel joy. He has hope when we have hope. He is glad when we are glad. He is a friend that sticks closer than a brother. But listen to this. Jonathan and David's covenant with each other was flawed. Not because of who they were, but because of life's circumstances. They were ripped apart. And after this conversation in 1 Samuel 23, that was the end. They didn't see each other again. And not too much later, Jonathan would die on the battlefield. And so as much as they were loyal to each other and at peace with each other and loved one another, their covenant was flawed. But Jesus' covenant with you is not flawed. Jesus said, I will never leave you or forsake you. That means that whatever path he has you walking right now, he is there with you. Whatever corner he takes you around, even if you didn't see it coming, he is there with you. When you reach what you think feels like the end of the road and you're not sure you can go on, he is there with you. He's the friend that sticks closer than a brother. He will never leave you or forsake you. That's why you can trust him. That's why you can fully submit yourself to his will, because he wants what is best for you. Do you remember those commercials back in the 80s and the 90s where some kid was saying, I want to be like Mike? Remember those? And I don't even remember what they were selling, if they were selling shoes or clothes or what, but Mike was Michael Jordan. And everybody's like, I want to be like Michael Jordan. I have to confess something to you. I know pastors aren't supposed to feel hatred in their heart, but I have a twinge of it towards Michael Jordan. I didn't like him because he played for the Chicago Bulls, and I was a diehard Detroit Pistons fan. And because the Pistons and the Bulls were arch rivals, I would watch games and just have nothing but bad feelings toward Michael Jordan. So when I would see those commercials, I want to be like Mike, I'd be like, I don't want to be like Mike. Whatever he's wearing, I'm not wearing it. I don't want to be like Mike. Now, if you're going to be a basketball player, being like Mike's not a bad thing. But I'm not sure he's the kind of person you want to model your entire life after. But maybe Jonathan is. Maybe we look at Jonathan and say, I do want to be like Jonathan. Man, what an awesome friend he was. I want to be that kind of friend. And the reason we want to be like Jonathan is because Jonathan was like Jesus. And I want nothing more than to be like Jesus. So maybe as I leave here this morning, I say to myself, if I want to be like Jonathan in my relationships, whether it's my friendships or my family or my marriage or my work, wherever it may be, if I want to be like Jonathan in my friendships, what can I give of myself for the good of others? Maybe it's my time. Maybe it's my energy. Maybe it's resources. Maybe it's the words I use. But what can I give of myself for the good of others? Because I want to be like Jonathan. And far more than that, I want to be like Jesus. Let's pray. Father, we thank you so much for friendships. Thank you for that amazing gift that mirrors your feelings towards us. Thank you for the opportunity that we have to give ourselves for the good of others. And in doing so, understand a little bit more of who your Son is. Thank you for this church that functions as a place where we can have these kinds of relationships. Pray for each person here this week as they go, that in each of their relationships, you would encourage them and inspire them and point out to them how they can be more like Jesus in those relationships. Help them to be willing to give up a little bit of themselves for the good of others. Help us to be wonderful representatives of you in your world. In your name, amen.